Thank you for joining us today as we take a look at Chapter 15, Part 2, the beginning of the actual fighting in the Civil War. Even though the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter, the first major land battle actually takes place at the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas Junction, in July of 1861. Now, there had been pressure put on Lincoln to try to end this war rather quickly, because the men who had volunteered had only signed up for a 3-month service, and their terms were about to expire. So, being pressured on the idea of on to Richmond to try to take the capital of the South, President Lincoln sends his Union Army under the command of Irvin McDowell to try to do just that. Now, even though they had some early success, eventually the Confederate States turned the tide with the help of Thomas J. Jackson, who gets the nickname Stonewall Jackson because his men kind of stood like a stone wall and didn't retreat or fall back. And also with the help of Jeb Stuart's cavalry, the overall Confederate leader, Beauregard, who had taken Fort Sumter, is able to have a pretty decisive victory here at Bull Run. And in fact, as the South kind of claims a victory, the Union kind of turns into kind of chaos, and they leave, kind of running away from the battlefield and kind of retreating back to Washington, D.C. But the calamitous retreat was further complicated by the hordes of onlookers who had come out to kind of have a picnic and watch this battle because they thought it was going to be such a kind of a neat little spectacle and a short war. But what people quickly realized was that this was going to be a very bloody war. It's also kind of the first modern war because of new types of canister shells and rifled artillery and different advances in warfare made it much more deadly and bloody. But what really revolutionized naval warfare was the use of ironclads, which were basically wooden ships with iron over the top of it to kind of further protect it. And we see the first ironclads ever fight, which will revolutionize naval warfare in the future because all wooden fleets will basically be obsolete. And it happened at Hampton Roads, Virginia in March of 1862. The Confederate ship, the Merrimac, renamed the Virginia, was wreaking havoc on the Union blockade. And on the first day of this battle, it had sank the Cumberland with its 1,500-pound battering ram, and it also ran the USS Congress aground. But day 2 came, and it witnessed that the Virginia was going after the USS Minnesota, but it was then distracted by the by the Monitor, who had come on the scene. Now, the smaller, more nimble Monitor was able to outmaneuver the Virginia as she was attempting to ram it and capsize it. But these two ironclads, finished the day exchanging blows back and forth, being unable to sink either one, and eventually they each kind of head off in their own directions. So even though it's kind of a draw, it doesn't really have a huge impact on the war, it does revolutionize the way naval warfare will be fought in the future. However, on land, things were quite different, as Lee was successful at defending Richmond and also having other victories throughout Virginia. As McDowell had lost the first Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln had sent McClellan, General George McClellan, to try to capture Richmond. He was unable to do that, so he was being recalled back to Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, Lee put Pope back or in charge of the Union Army, and he loses the second Battle of Bull Run. So at this point now, Lee decides to go on the offensive and take the war to northern soil. And he invades in Maryland in September of 1862 to try to get the fighting out of the South to protect their cities and countryside, but also to try to get European support for the Southern cause. Thinking if they could have a victory up north, they might get recognized as an independent nation. And then 3, this would also put pressure on Lincoln in the North to maybe try to come up with a peace settlement ending the war if they felt more threatened. But what we witness is roughly 23,000 men either killed, wounded, or go missing after 12 savage hours of combat in what becomes the single bloodiest day of the Civil War. Antietam is fought to kind of an indecisive conclusion. Neither side really claiming a victory, as the North suffers 12,000 casualties and the South suffers roughly 11,000. But the big thing here is that as Lee retreats to the south, McClellan, who gets the nickname Tardy George because he's always too cautious and too slow, fails to go after him and capture Lee and his men as they retreat. And so Lincoln becomes upset with this and relieves him of his duties once again. But what Antietam did provide was a so-called victory for the North, even though it was inconclusive, so that Lincoln could issue his Emancipation Proclamation. For it was after this victory, he said that come January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation would take effect, which would free any slaves in the Confederate states that were still at war. So anybody who came back to the United States and stopped fighting would be able to keep their slaves, including those border states in red who had stayed loyal. It didn't free any slaves there either. But another thing that this was aimed to do was try to keep Europe neutral. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, it almost guaranteed that France or England or anybody else would not recognize the Confederate States of America. And the Emancipation Proclamation had far-reaching consequences for the North as well in their war effort, for Frederick Douglass and others went about recruiting black soldiers. And over 100,000 African-American soldiers end up fighting in the Civil War. And in the Navy, 1 out of 10 sailors will actually be African-American. And so this really encourages the enlistment of the African-Americans to try to fight to end the institution of slavery. One of the first all-black regiments was the 54th and 55th Regiments of Massachusetts, led by Robert Gould Shaw, a white officer who was leading the African-American soldiers. And even though they risked, being put to death or sent back to slavery, these men fought very bravely. And even though they took, less pay, and sometimes were stuck in menial tasks and weren't always given a chance to fight, they still served the North very bravely. But turning our attention westward, we come to Vicksburg. It was the last Southern stronghold along the Mississippi. As Admiral David Farragut had captured New Orleans and was working his way northward up the Mississippi, General Grant had captured Fort Henry and Donaldson and was kind of moving southward down the Mississippi. And the last place he had to take control of was Vicksburg. Now, to get there proved to be quite difficult. He actually had to move south of Vicksburg, cross the Mississippi River. He captured the capital of Jackson, Mississippi, and then moved westward to Vicksburg, which lie on some bluffs overlooking the Mississippi. And from May 18th to July 4th, 1863, General Grant lays siege to the city of Vicksburg. He uses his artillery to shell that city and pound away at it, making its residents have to seek refuge in caves and hillsides. And they surrounded them and were bombarding for so long they were running short on food and had resort to eating rats and mice and anything else that they could find. So after some 40-some days of bombardment, eventually on July 4th, General Pemberton, the Confederate leader, had to surrender as his 20,000 men had been reduced by disease and starvation, and eventually surrendered the city of Vicksburg, which was the last stronghold along the Mississippi. And it would be some 81 years before the city of Vicksburg would celebrate the 4th of July again. But with this victory, Grant becomes kind of Lincoln's #1 general and will actually be moved out east to assume command of all Union forces. Looking back to the Eastern Campaign once again, we see that General Lee was able to defeat General Burnside at Fredericksburg, defeat General Hooker at Chancellorsville, and that encouraged Lee to go on the offensive once again, this time up into Pennsylvania at Gettysburg, where he meets General Meade. So at the same time Vicksburg's being fought, another decisive battle is fought at Gettysburg. Now, Lee went on the offensive again, one, hoping to find food that his men desperately needed, two, to try to threaten more northern cities and encourage the war-weary Northerners to push for peace. And so he meets Meade's men just outside of Gettysburg. And on day one, the Confederates drive the Union defenders through Gettysburg southward towards Cemetery Hill, where they'll kind of put up their defenses. The second day of fighting, we see Lee striking at the Union flanks, and with severe fighting taking place at Devil's Den and the Little Round Top. And the Confederates had gained some land, but failed to dislodge the North from Cemetery Ridge. But the decisive third day comes, and it witnesses the famous Pickett's Charge. After heavily bombarding the center of Union lines, Lee sends his infantry under General Pickett to charge at the center of the Union lines. And with 12,000 men, Pickett leads this charge. He breaks through just for a little bit, but then is repelled and forced to retreat back. But while charging over this mile-wide prairie grass, his men were being picked apart by artillery and gunfire, and Pickett's men were decimated by this defensive positioning of the Union Army. But with these two key victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July of 1863, we see the tide turning in favor of the North. 4 months after this battle, Lincoln visits to commemorate those who had fallen and gives his famous Gettysburg Address. However, even with this victory, Lincoln's upset that Meade did not pursue Lee and finish him off. And so at this point, he will transfer Grant from out west, move him east, and to try to finish the job. And that's something we'll take a look at in our next episode.